So we're going to go ahead and get started. So before we start Ask the Experts, I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis of what Ask the Experts is. So Ask the Experts was originally conceptualized by our president, Leanne West, and any age is welcome to participate. So we have kids on the call. We also have adults on the call. Just so that you know, me and Abby will be asking questions directly to Mary Jo at the beginning of the session. And then you will have an opportunity to engage in dialogue with Mary Jo with questions that you ask in the chat. You can ask them in the chat or you can ask them orally as well. And Mary Jo wants this session to be more interactive. So she's actually going to be asking you questions as well, which we're very excited about because bioethics is a perfect topic to actually engage you like that. So we're very excited to have you all on today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and ask Mary Jo to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her journey in bioethics.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Mary Jo Klein, and I have just started a class in bioethics that I'm teaching at Wittenberg University in Dayton, Ohio. But I've always been interested in bioethics. I think it's the most important part of philosophy for me to contribute to. So, yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Perfect. Thank you. And again, she's a professor, so she's been studying this and she has a nuanced understanding and can answer any questions that you have. And I'm going to go ahead and give it off to Abby.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sabina. So what can you tell us a little bit about your journey in bioethics?
Sure. So I have a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Rhode Island and a doctorate in philosophy from Marquette University. And my main area was philosophy of the person and ethics. So I actually taught ethics at Marquette University. And ethics is more of a broad term. So I was always very interested in bioethics. I also had a professor at the University of Rhode Island, and I was his teaching assistant, and he taught bioethics. So I graded all his papers and things like that. I took a class specifically in bioethics at Ave Maria University, and then I was hired at Wittenberg University to teach bioethics. I'll be teaching that this semester. Next semester, I'm teaching ethics. So yeah, it's very exciting.
Very exciting. Thank you so much, Mary Jo. Sabina?
And then can you tell us more about what bioethics is and why it's important?
Absolutely. So, first of all, we need to know what ethics is. And ethics is a study of the principles by which we judge behaviors and action as either good or bad, moral or immoral. And bioethics uses those same principles and applies them to the areas of biology and medicine.
Perfect. Thank you. So again, that's a very rudimentary definition. Remember, good and bad within the healthcare space. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And then Abby?
So, Mary Jo, how does bioethics and an understanding of bioethics help doctors and nurses make tough decisions?
So, whenever we have to make a tough decision, we have to have some principles by which to judge that action. And I would like, if it's okay, I'd like to open it up to our audience and ask them, what do you think is, what do we have to keep in mind when we're making these decisions? Like, what's the standard or the reference point for making bioethical decisions? Does anybody have any idea?
And you
Feel
can
free
say,
to put it in the chat as well if
Okay,
you don't want to.
sure. Oh, yeah, if they want to answer in the chat.
Yeah.
yes. So again, you can answer in the chat or you can say it out loud if you feel comfortable.
Okay, so Mary Rose said, what is the object, intention, and circumstance of the action? That's a great answer. And that's definitely true. That's what we want to look at for a particular action. What is the action that you're doing? What is the person's intention? And what are the circumstances? Very good. Um, and I guess even more fundamental, okay, 4 principles of medicine. Very good. And maybe some of you had studied bioethics before because there are 4 principles that people usually talk about. And we can get into them in a bit, but I'll just name what they are. They're justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, and autonomy. And those are principles that are pretty generally accepted by which we would judge an action to be right or wrong. But I guess I'm thinking like even more fundamentally, like when we think maybe it's so obvious that it's too obvious, but the answer I was really looking for is the human person. So the human person should be served by medicine and by science. And so whatever action that we perform, whether it's research or experimentation or some sort of new treatment, we always want to keep the human person at the forefront of our decisions.
100% agree with that, Mary Jo. We're, even beyond just the four principles, always keeping the patient or the person in mind. And that's what iCAN does.
Right.
And then with that, because you said it should be so patient and person-centric, what role do patients have in bioethics, and do their opinions matter when making decisions?
Yes, their opinions, of course, matter. If we take those four principles, we can say autonomy is usually the one that we think of first, where the patient has a right to know what's going to happen to them if there's a treatment. We think of like a clinical trial or something like that. What are the risks involved? Are they really understanding what's happening? And of course, in iCAN, we always talk about informed consent and informed assent to make sure the patient really knows. And so the patient does have a say. The doctors and nurses and healthcare workers also have a say because they have their own consciences and their own ideas on things. And so there's also respect for the autonomy of the physician. And the thing is that sometimes these four principles can conflict. So you can maybe imagine a time where you have a patient who maybe wants a particular treatment, but perhaps the doctor thinks that that treatment might be harmful or that it's too risky, and that doctor may not feel comfortable giving that particular treatment. So we have to weigh these different attitudes. We have the principle of beneficence, which is the doctor making sure that they are helping the patient and doing good for the patient. And non-maleficence means that the doctor is not going to do any harm. So there's justice, which means the patient has to, have access to health care and that there's equality, but there's also autonomy. So you can see that the autonomy of the patient and the autonomy of the doctor can come into conflict if the doctor thinks that they would be doing something that would hurt the patient. So then the patient has the right to maybe go to a different doctor, maybe see if someone else will give them the treatment. And the doctor has the right to say, this is against my conscience because I'm afraid I'm going to hurt you if I do this. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, and thank you so much for delineating exactly what the four principles are. It helped a lot, especially as someone who's not really familiar with them.
Mhm.
And also knowing that, if a doctor says, consciously they can't do that, then you have a right to go to another doctor if that's what you think is best for your care.
Right.
Thank you, Mary Jo. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Abby.
Thank you. So Mary Jo, can you give us an example of a bioethics problem, for example, medicine or science, and how people have solved it?
I can. And let me answer your question, but then I'm hoping that after that we can do a little philosophy together. And so I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So one example is in research ethics. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Tuskegee study in Alabama many years ago, but it was a study that started, I believe, in maybe the 1930s. And a group of Black men who were very poor were asked to engage in this study. Some of them had syphilis, which is at that time they didn't have any cure for it, and it was fatal. It was very, very bad, a very bad disease. And somewhere around maybe like 15 years after the study started, penicillin was shown to be effective in curing it. But instead of giving the participants penicillin, they allowed them to just let the disease take its natural course, which ended in death. So this was brought out to the public's attention, and it's like just a few months later the study was ended. But people were really outraged by this disrespect for the human person, and they came up with something called the Belmont Report that delineates how to treat a patient ethically in a study. And there are things like informed consent, which we already talked about, do no harm to the patient, making sure it's not a risky procedure, a risky study. The study has to have a good reason for it. It can't just be, let's just do this for the sake of doing it. So there are many principles in the Belmont report that explain this. But I would love to do some philosophy with our participants. And so since we know that the human person is the basis for making all our decisions, I would like to ask all of you, what is a human person? each one of us is a person, but have you ever thought about what is a person? So if you just like stop for a minute and do some self-reflection, ask yourself what makes you different and unique from an animal, a plant, a rock, and other beings that exist. What makes a person unique?
And
Yeah.
again, you can answer in the chat or aloud.
Okay, I love the answer so far. Thank you. So Mary Rose says the ability to reason. That's excellent. Madeline and James have everyone has different personalities. Excellent answer. Anything else? And again, we're doing philosophy because since you're a person, you have an experience of yourself. And so you can reflect back on yourself and say, what is it that I can do? What can I do that a hamster can't do? What can I do that my dog doesn't do? What can a reason? Yes. Different personalities? Yes. Anything else? So I'll throw a couple of them in there too. Um, empathize. I love that. That's a great one. Thanks, Abby. Um, anybody else? Okay. So what about what we're doing right now? You know, asking questions, self-reflecting, love and communicate. Awesome. Thank you so much. That's great. Those are two really good answers. Um, exactly. Only think about this. Have you ever thought about how many times you use the word I? I love you. I'm hungry. I like to hike. And only a person can say I. So that is something that is unique to a person. Um, animals are amazing. We have a lot of pets. We love animals. But only persons have a history. So, you know, if you think about something that an animal does that's really neat, like bees are, I think, so cool. If you ever study bees, you know, they can tell you they can tell the other bees like exactly where the nectar is by how many miles even and which direction. Or you think about like a weaver bird's nest is so beautiful and intricate, but that weaver bird's nest is the same as it was 100 years ago. There isn't any progress. Whereas you know, when human beings first started making structures, they didn't make, you know, a beautiful Gothic cathedral. They started in a hi there. They started, you know, with something simple and they were able to progress. So if you think of like the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, you know, there's progress in human person. So the reason I'm talking about what is a human person is because it's really a fun thing to think about since we're all persons. And it helps us to realize the beautiful dignity and value that every single human person has. And so the proper response to that value and dignity is it should be a profound respect for persons. So I guess the next thing after that would be if we if we know what a person is, um, who gets to decide who is a person and who isn't a person? It's kind of I'm asking sort of a tough question. Anybody have an idea? Who decides who's a person and who's not a person? So we know that persons can do all these different things, right? We know persons can love, they can communicate, they can reason, they have different personalities, they can empathize, they can say I. You know, what's undergirding all of these different abilities is consciousness, right? And also the idea of identity. So I am the person that I was just a few moments ago when I started asking you about what a person is. I'm the same person as I was several years ago. Um, I'm the same person I was, you know, many years ago. Let's see, socially constructed. Okay. Um, any other ideas of who gets to decide? We know that different people have different abilities, right? Some people are better at math, some people are better at science, some people are better at art. You know, we're not really equal when it comes to our abilities, but we are equal in the most fundamental sense. And can anyone tell me what that fundamental sense is? What makes us all equal, no matter what abilities we have or don't? Even let's take someone who's unconscious or in a coma, or asleep even, or a tiny infant. What makes us all equal, would you say? So part of our Constitution in the United States is everyone's created equal. What makes us all equal? What makes us all persons?
Again, feel free to answer in the chat or aloud. I know these are very thoughtful questions,
They're
but
hard questions. I know. So, you know,
but I
what
think
might
they're good
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. What might be helpful is if you think about the difference between functioning as a person and being a person. So function versus being. We all have dignity just by being human. Thank you, Joey. That is just the exact answer I was looking for. Absolutely. So I think if we, the question is really this: are we functioning as a person because we already are a person? Or do we kind of test whether something is a person or not by seeing if they are functioning as a person? Can you guys see how different those two things are? In the second case, you're basically making sure that everybody can check off these different things that a person can do, and then you'll say, yes, you're a person. The problem with that is that there are times in our life when we can't function as a person. Being asleep, being in a coma, having a brain injury, maybe having some kind of disease where we're not able to use our brain in the way that it's actually meant to be used. So if we say that you have to function as a person in order to be a person, in order to be respected, therefore, as a person and have moral worth and be able to be protected and respected, then what happens is who decides what this criteria is? And what happens with that, the big problem with that is that the people who have a voice, the people who have power, maybe the people who have money, people who have influence, they are the people who are going to decide who is and isn't a person. And what it leaves out are whole groups of people. So if we take the time in our society where we had slavery allowed, a whole part of our population, the Black population, was considered non-persons. In fact, even legally, they were called 3/4 of a person. So the evil of that sort of an attitude is that these were human beings, and these human beings, as human beings, are all persons. So it solves a lot of problems if you just say every single human being is a person. So I was wondering if there are any questions about that. I know these are heavy questions. Maybe some of you haven't thought
But
about philosophy before, but
I think they're great. Honestly, I'm very engaged.
they're
Again,
important.
so again, what Mary Jo was saying, like the people who have a voice are typically those who have power, money, and they get to decide who a person is, leaving out whole groups. And historically, people of color have been marginalized and kind of left out of the conversation because they weren't determined as, the full person. And so in today's day and age, we should all be seen as equal and having that voice to make sure that we have a say in things that happen to us, especially within the healthcare space. So if you have any questions on that, put in the chat, or if not, we can move on. But I think these are really great things to think about if you haven't thought about them before.
That's a great summary. Thanks, Sabina. Another thing, we have to know what the human person is in order to treat that person with respect and dignity. And it reminds me of, so we used to live in Southwest Florida for about 15 years, and there were a lot of hurricanes, and everybody knew that are y'all still there?
Yes.
Okay. Somehow I lost video. I'm not sure why. But anyway, I'll just keep on going. So we lived in Southwest Florida, and everybody knew that we loved animals. So many times birds would be they would just be blown out of their nests by the hurricane, and people would bring these little baby birds to us. I'm not sure what they expected us to do with them. We ended up just driving them into the town where there was a preserve that helped animals that were hurt. But anyway, some of my kids were quite little, and they just loved the fact that we had this little baby bird in the house, even for a few hours, and they would always want to feed the bird. And I would say, you cannot feed this little bird because we don't know what kind of bird it is. Maybe the bird only eats bugs and you're trying to feed it bread. You can't take care of this bird correctly unless you know what the bird is. And we can say that's a parallel with the human person. In order to truly respect a human person and give that person the response that they deserve, we have to know what the human person is. And of course, there are, a variety of different theories about that. One basic theory is called utilitarianism, which is that a person doesn't have any value in and of themselves, but only according to what they produce. And I think that it's a very dangerous philosophy because, again, we leave out vulnerable patients, vulnerable population. A different view, the opposite view really, is that you have value and dignity just for who you are, the kind of being that you are, which is a human being. So that view is called personalism. This is kind of strange because I can't see anybody. So are you all still there?
We're
Mm-hmm.
still there.
Okay.
And also, Mary Jo, Mary Rose had a question. She wanted to know, what is death and how much bioethics goes into the topic of death?
Oh gosh, that's an awesome question. Thank you, Mary Rose. It's a very timely question, Mary Rose, because the the Uniform Determination of Death Act was just recently reviewed. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Uniform Law Commission, but they try to make laws that are uniform across the whole United States. Wouldn't it be strange if someone was declared dead in Ohio, but in Florida they were considered still alive, so that's the reason why they have this Uniform Law Commission. And by the way, Sabina, for some reason, since I can't see the chat, thank you so much for letting me know if someone has a question. So I'm really sorry about that. I'm at a library. I don't really quite know what's happening. But anyway, so as far as death is concerned, the Uniform Determination of Death Act states that a person is determined dead if either they have irreversible cessation of both cardiorespiratory function, and irreversible means that you can't resuscitate them. And then the other way you can determine death is by complete cessation of all the function of the brain, including the brainstem and the hypothalamus. And the big question that they had recently, the reason why they're trying to decide whether they should redefine death or redefine how you determine death, was that sometimes patients were being declared dead by clinical criteria, and yet that patient was left on the respirator and they didn't actually ever cease functioning. In fact, there is this case of a young girl, her name is Jahai McMath, and she lived in California, and she actually went through puberty while she was declared brain dead. She lived for about 8 years on with the ventilator's help. Another lady went through pregnancy and she delivered her baby while she was declared brain dead. So there's obviously a problem here, and the argument was, do we change the determination of death? Do we change the definition of death so that we can allow someone who is like so-called brain dead but still has hypothalamic function that would allow puberty and growth and gestating pregnancies and things like that? Do we allow that to actually still be called dead? Or do we change the clinical tests that test for death? Because the clinical tests are obviously not testing for hypothalamic function and for brainstem function sometimes. And I was listening to a number of podcasts on this topic. It was very interesting to me. And one of the neurologists was saying that if you have a definition of death that's based on biology, that's what you should have. And so it doesn't make sense to take a poor test and change the definition of death to change the definition of death to coincide with a poor testing rather than changing the testing to coincide with what's biologically correct. So that's a pretty heavy duty topic. I hope you all followed it, but if you have any questions, please let me know.
And I think that questions like these and Mary Jo's answer is how you really understand the importance of thinking and answering these questions when you're talking about how it really starts to disseminate and interact with our real world. So, sometimes you can think of these topics and these questions, they're very high level. You're like, how does this really impact me? And then you have this example with our law. And so much of law, of procedure, and again, how it drives the healthcare and medical space that directly impacts us as patients is informed by who's answering questions and what those questions are looked like. And so even though it may seem very removed from you at this time, it's really important to be able to kind of have a good understanding of these questions and what people are asking. And so you can see down the line what this looks like and what these questions are looking like when you have real world situations. And so sometimes that can be a little scary, thinking about questions that are so kind of large and kind of maybe intimidating, but it's equally as important to be able to kind of understand the implication and the impacts of the answers to these questions. So that's some of the reasons why we host kind of sessions like this, is that you guys can get a taste and an introductory session a little bit to some of these large real world questions by an expert just like Mary Jo.
Thank you, Abby.
That's awesome, Abby. Thank you.
And then Mary Jo, I wanted to know, how do bioethicists help with decisions, like with things related to organ transplants or clinical trials? Because actually some of our kids have gone through clinical trials. So we would like to talk about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would very much like to answer that. Well, we have our 4 principles that we talked about. So again, they're justice, autonomy, non-maleficence, which is do no harm, and beneficence, which is actually do something that's good. And I would like to add that these principles have to be grounded in something. So what they're grounded in my opinion, is the nature of the human person. And so when we have conflicts between the different principles, we always go back to the idea that we respect a human person. And I would also like to add a couple of other principles that will help us when we apply them to research ethics, which would include clinical trials and organ donation. One of them is that we should never do something that is evil in itself. So this would be very opposite to the utilitarian view that I talked about earlier, that says that a person is only valuable according to what they can do. Um, to say that certain actions are evil in and of themselves is to say that you're judging them not just according to the consequences, but according to what they are. So an example would be torture. Torture is something that's never allowable. And so even if you could like kill one innocent person to save 100, you're never allowed to do that. And this goes along with the Hippocratic Oath, which is a really neat thing to look up. If you have a chance, look up the Hippocratic Oath. I've looked up several translations of it, and it's really pretty cool. We can talk about that later if you want. But the second principle I wanted to add is that because of the great value and dignity of every single human person, a person can never be used as a means to an end. And this would also apply to the idea of clinical research. You might be able to, put a person in a study and get a lot of good information out of it, but you always have to respect that person. Sometimes people are a means to an end. I mean, if I hire someone to mow my lawn, then that person is a means to the end of my lawn being mowed. But I never treat that person only as a means, because the person who's mowing my lawn is a human person. They deserve respect, they deserve kindness, they deserve to be paid well for what they do. So if we add those 2 principles together with the other 4 that I talked about, we talk about, we can start with organ donation. With organ donation, there are some rules that have been put into place, and one of them is called the dead donor law. And the dead donor law states that a person must actually be dead before their vital organs are removed. Of course, this doesn't apply to something like a kidney or a part of a liver where you could still be alive and give one kidney because you have another one, or give part of your liver, you have another, big piece of liver to help you stay alive. But if you donate a vital organ, the patient has to be declared dead. And so this goes back to the Uniform Determination of Death Act. If you think about something that's life-saving like organ donation, and something that's very it's in the realm of beneficence, or you try to do good to other people, it's a very generous thing to donate organs. But typically, I think a person who's donating organs wants to make sure that their organs won't be taken away before they're actually dead. They don't want organ donation to be what kills them. And so the dead donor rule is very important, and so is the idea of what death actually is. And that's where we come up with the Uniform Determination of Death Act. So again, a person would have to have, in this case with organ donation, they don't want to take the person off the ventilator because that really affects the quality of the organs. So then death is determined according to brain activity. And so we just want to make sure that a doctor would test for activity of the entire brain, including the hypothalamus and the brainstem, to make sure the person is actually dead. And then they can take those organs and hopefully help a lot of different people. The other thing you mentioned was clinical trials. In a clinical trial, we have to make sure that the the person who might be a participant um, really comprehends what's going to happen or what might happen, the risks that are involved, any sort of pain that they may undergo, how long the study will take, the fact that they can at any time leave the study. Like many things that are all about respect for the person have to be a part of that. And of course, there are very strict rules for research with human subjects. I know my kids always like to be in science fairs, and sometimes they wanted to have a human subject, like with a survey. And there are very, very strict rules about even something as simple as a survey, what, to make sure that that person has informed consent, or that if they're not old enough, that their parents have been a part of that consent, to make sure that it wouldn't be a survey that would maybe harm them even psychologically. Maybe they're asked questions that would be disturbing in some way. They have to make sure that we don't harm anybody, no matter what kind of research good we can get. We don't use those persons as means to an end, no matter how good the end is. We have to make sure that we care about each and every individual person, especially the very vulnerable, the very young, the sick, the persons who have some kind of a disease. We have to really protect them.
Thank you, Mary Jo. And that's where you have also like IRB that comes in, where clinical trials and research projects actually have to be reviewed to make sure that people are not being used as a means to an end. Thank you, Mary Jo. And then also, what are some new challenges in bioethics today, like with new technologies such as AI or gene editing?
Okay, great question. So I actually took a class at AI, the ethics of AI. It was very fun. It's a free class; anybody can take it. It was from the University of Helsinki, and they were talking about how to make sure that persons are respected when it comes to AI. There are a number of issues with AI. Privacy is a big one. Even though we can gather data on persons, and we can use that data to really help a lot of other people, we have to make sure that a person is consenting to their data being used and that their data is kept private. So that is a big consideration. There are some sort of, I think, fears when it comes to AI that I don't think are grounded. Like some people think that AI is going to sort of take over the world, for example, or somehow that a machine would become conscious and then we have to worry about it being evil. You watch these different movies like iRobot and things like that. And um, I don't believe that a machine can ever become conscious, because a machine is a physical thing. And if we think about what we talked about being persons, that a person's able to love, that a person's able to have empathy, that a person's able to say the word I, um, those aren't things that my body does. Those are things that I do. And again, remember I said that your idea of the nature of a person is going to determine how you treat that person. Well, there are people who believe that a person is just their body. The person is just completely physical. And you would treat people much differently if you believe that than if, on the other hand, you believe that a person has a body, that I am not just my body, but that I use my body. My body is very important to who I am as a person. I use my brain to think. So the difference would be between thinking, on the one hand, a materialist would believe that you only are your body and that your brain, some of the materialists said something like, your brain secretes thoughts the way a liver secretes bile. So if you believe that, again, you're not thinking that the person would necessarily have freedom, that, it's a very different way of believing things. The other option would be materialism, where you think that you have a body, but you're not exactly the same thing as your body, and that there is sort of a non-physical part of the human person. And the way you would say is, I can say I, but my body can't say I. I'm conscious, but my body isn't conscious. I can understand. One of you said that understanding is something that human persons can do. That was a really very deep thing to say, that only persons can communicate in that certain way. Um, and the idea of communication, and not just animal communication, but the idea that you can understand a concept, which is an immaterial thing, presupposes that you have part of you is something more than just physical. Actually, what I wanted to ask everybody is, this might sound kind of off like kind of crazy, like why is she asking this? But when you think about the idea of a tree, think about when you think of a tree, what image comes to mind? Like, for example, what type of tree comes to mind? And again, I can't see the chat. So if you guys could just maybe say it out loud, or if Sabrina, if you don't mind saying to me, what type of tree comes to mind when you think of tree?
Okay. No one has answered
I
yet.
think of a palm tree.
Okay,
I live nearby the beach, so.
I love that. Yeah.
Same.
And then Mumina says a maple tree.
Okay.
Like an oak tree.
An oak tree. Okay, awesome. So, I grew up in Chicago, so I think of a maple or an oak. My youngest two children grew up in Florida, and so they would probably say palm tree. But when think of a little child who's learning what a tree is, and you point to an oak tree and you say tree, and you point to an elm tree and you say tree, and then all of a sudden you see a palm tree, very, very different, and you say tree. When that child really understands what a tree is, they understand that all those very, very different types of tree, a banyan tree, a very strange tree, which I think is pretty cool. They understand all those different trees have something in common. And that's the reason why scientists have grouped them together under that category. And so when you understand what a tree is, you're understanding more than just a size or a shape or a color, a shape of leaf. You're understanding a meaning, a sort of immaterial universal meaning, which is called a concept. So if you think of an oak tree, which is maybe what I think of, or a maple tree, and I can close my eyes and I can imagine what this tree looks like, I have this particular image. But if I think of the concept of tree, my concept doesn't have a shape or a size or a color or a shape of leaf. The concept itself is something immaterial. And so philosophers have argued that to be able to understand a concept demonstrates that a human person has to have something about them that is immaterial. And it's not no, we're not talking about religion. We're just talking about some aspect of a person that's more than just a human body. So anyway, a little bit more philosophy thrown in there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. And I think this is a really interesting metaphor for the aspect of philosophy. And metaphors, by the way, are a great way to start continuing to learn about different aspects of life. That's why we use them. And so if you're maybe struggling to understand a concept, a metaphor, and other tools of learning are really great examples of how to better understand and maybe simplify a concept or a different way of learning. So very fun. Okay.
Another thing to keep, oh, I'm sorry, did you have something to say, Sabina?
No. Go on, please.
Okay. So I was just going to say another thing that's important to keep in mind is that different disciplines have different methods. So, for example, in science, the methods that we use are based on the fact that our subject matter is the physical world. So we use our five senses when we use science. In science, we talk about things that we can weigh and measure. And if a scientist ever said something like, angels don't exist, you would say, well, how could you prove that? The whole definition of an angel is that an angel is something non-physical. Science deals with the physical world. So we have science that deals with the physical world, and we use our five senses. Now, philosophy, even though the philosophy should begin with the physical world and the five senses, philosophy goes beyond that to the idea of concepts, which is what we just talked about. And so the subject matter of philosophy can include things that are non-physical. Now, the interesting thing about bioethics is that it's philosophy and science together. So it doesn't mean that we're going to mix our methods, because there are, biological and scientific parts of bioethics. And I'm not going to say, as a philosopher, I'm not going to reason and say, well, there really no such thing as evolution, for example, because I've reasoned through. Well, you say, well, we have physical proof of this, or we have physical proof that this virus causes a disease. So philosophy is not going to infringe on the scientific method or the scientific subject matter. But on the other hand, the philosopher has concepts that are not based on something that you can see, feel, and touch. And so the scientist on the other end has to respect the philosopher's subject matter. And the way this really comes into play is that even though the scientist has certain methods, and we have a scientific method, for example, this might sound kind of shocking, but we can talk about the basic foundations of science, and they are not scientifically provable. Okay, so I'll give you some examples if that sounds shocking to you. Kind of like meta science, talking about science, about the methods. So science, in fact, let me ask you a question. What does science assume that it doesn't prove? Anybody think of an idea? If you're a scientist and you are doing experimentation, or you're a physician trying to run a clinical trial, what are you assuming at the most fundamental level that you're not proving, but you're assuming it to be true?
Well, you can't, like, you have to have a starting point. It's like even in math, you have to accept something as true. You've got to accept that A equals A. And you
Right.
can't prove that A equals A unless you already have accepted that as like a fundamental truth. That's not exactly science, but that's my best example.
No, that's a great example. Thank you so much. Is that you, Mary Rose?
Yes, it's Mary Rose.
Okay. I can't see anybody. It's so strange. Anybody else have any? That's a great idea, a great thought. Anybody else? What would a scientist assume before they even start the experiment? What are they assuming? So Mary Rose said that A equals A, which is the principle of identity, that something is itself, right? Anything else? What does a scientist assume about the physical world that allows them to even run an experiment? Any
Mary
of
Rose,
these are
Mary
they're hard
Rose,
questions, I know. Go ahead.
Mary Rose says theories.
Okay. So that you do usually start with a theory, and then you try to test what the theory is. Anything even more basic about the nature of the world? What do we assume? And I can give an example if
Frost
no.
says scientists come up with a hypothesis before they begin an experiment, and Mamina says
Right.
maybe supernatural explanation.
Supernatural explanation.
Mhm.
So, okay, that's interesting that you say supernatural. When I think supernatural, I kind of think of something that's beyond the realm of science. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that, about what you mean by that. So if you want to explain a little more, that would be great.
I'm saying that science can't answer questions about the existence of gods or supernatural entities. So I'd say
I see.
that's yeah.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you so much. And that's because that's outside their subject matter, right? Supernatural beings are not physical, and so science doesn't study them. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, let's say you have a seed, and let's say you have an acorn, and you plant your acorn, and a month later you come back, you've been watering it the whole time, and all of a sudden you see that the acorn is turned into a flamingo. That's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen. The scientist assumes that there is order in the world.
Mm.
Experiments only make sense because there's order. And sometimes we're surprised, right? So we can be surprised at things in creation, things in the world. We can be surprised about things that we thought. Scientific reasoning is called inductive reasoning. I'm not sure if y'all know the difference between inductive and deductive, but when a scientist, puts things into categories, for example, let's say the category of mammals. So the scientist comes up with what a mammal would be. So a mammal, you guys, can you think of what mammals are? What are some things that we know about mammals?
Covered in fur.
Okay, so if mammals have fur, what else?
Joey said a backbone.
Okay,
Mary Rose said warm-blooded.
warm-blooded, good, great. Anything else? So warm-blooded, backbone, they
Produce
give milk. Sorry?
milk. Afra said produce milk.
Excellent. So give milk to their babies. I just want to say that. Thank you. And give birth to live young is what scientists thought. And if you think of all the different mammals that you can name off the top of your head, dolphins and dogs and cats and, elephants and people, and we can just go on and on with all the different mammals, and you say all of them give birth to live young. But does anybody know of an exception to that?
Platypus, maybe?
Platypus, exactly. So when researchers first saw a platypus, they realized that it was a mammal, but they found out that it laid eggs. And so any sort of inductive reasoning, which means going to each particular thing, like I look and see, what does a dog do? What does a horse do? What does an elephant do? What does a human person do? What does a dolphin do? I find that all of those give birth to live young. My conclusion only has probability. It doesn't have absolute certainty. And we can see that in a very, interesting way with platypus, because we say we have a mammal. It is actually a mammal, but it lays eggs. And it's an interesting story. When the researchers first found a platypus, they actually sent a platypus skin back to, I think it was England, if I'm not mistaken. And people who received this platypus skin thought they were joking. They thought they had sewn together like the bill of a duck and the body of maybe a beaver or something like that. They just did not believe that was actually a real animal. And so that's another thing about scientific method, is we do work on inductive reasoning. Now, a philosopher can also use inductive reasoning, but more often they use deductive reasoning. So we start off with some sort of a principle, and let's say we can use a principle within science. So for example, if I say all mammals are warm-blooded, and then I say my dog Belle is a mammal, therefore my dog is warm-blooded. So in deductive reasoning, if I have true premises, my conclusion follows with necessity. My conclusion has to be true. So if a scientist can use this sort of reasoning, they can come up with further truths from things that they already know. But many times their reasoning is based on just gathering data, and then they try to come up with a conclusion that has only probable reasoning. So I feel like we're kind of getting a little bit away from bioethics. Are there any questions in bioethics that anyone has, like a specifically
We did have 2
bioethical?
questions in the chat. So one of the
Awesome.
questions,
Abby,
sorry, go
sorry,
ahead, Sabina.
someone had messaged me much earlier, so I'm gonna ask theirs first.
Sure, go ahead.
This is from Afras. So are animals considered to be unequal to humans, and where does this make sense, and where does sentience play into this?
I love that. That is a great question. So we know that animals are sentient. We know that they feel pain. We know that some animals are extremely intelligent. What I would say is that if an animal would truly be able to say I, and I mean like it seems to us that animals only have consciousness outward, but if an animal could actually have consciousness back onto themselves, and if we could say that an animal is actually self-conscious, and an animal could actually say the word I, then we would have to admit that that animal was a person. Great question.
Thank you, Mary Jo. And then the next one is from Joey. So in the context of radiology, are future privacy concerns due to AI's critical dependency on data from cyber attacks, breaches, leaks be any different than that of current radiologists breaching HIPAA?
That's an awesome question. I think any sort of breach in privacy I think we can look at it in the same. I don't think there's really a difference. There are certainly issues with AI. I don't know if you ever remember that example. I forgot what year it was, but there was a pilot who was flying a plane. I actually have a couple different examples. One is a pilot who was flying a plane, and there was something wrong with the control, like some of the data that the controls were getting, and the plane kept like doing a nosedive. And then you say, well, is AI safer? To put the plane in the hands of AI, is that safer, or is it safer to put the plane in the hands of a human person who can make mistakes, right? Because you say, well, can the computer really make mistakes? So it's really an important thing, isn't it? Because if the only way AI works is by data. And if another thing too is if your data is not comprehensive, if it leaves certain people out, there is a lot of potential for the conclusions to be, let's say, racist or ageist, or to not account for a vulnerable population. So AI, there are some risks, but the risks I believe it can be mitigated if it's all about the data, right? It's not just, AI isn't some sort of mystical, conscious machine. That's not what AI is. AI is just data, and it's a lot of data that's being crunched. I mean, AI is pretty amazing. I don't know if you've ever like put a prompt in to have AI come up with an image. Like there are some amazing images AI can come out. You can put a prompt in for a poem. My son took my dog Belle and said, write a poem about my dog Belle. And it was like all these stanzas about the dog. So it can do amazing things, but we do have to be really, really cautious to make sure that the data that we're using are representative of our population, and they're not leaving anybody out, and that they're accurate. And of course, that they are protected so that people's privacy isn't being breached.
Thank you.
Oh, I didn't know that. Thanks so much. I had no clue that AI algorithms could like perpetuate human biases.
Absolutely.
And is that because like the algorithm is trained on data that inherits biases, or it's because the data included does not represent population characteristics?
That's a great question. I think both can be the case. If I only take certain populations as part of my data, I'm certainly going to leave other people out. But sometimes there is data bias built in, and then since we have so many numbers of people, I can totally perpetuate that bias if I'm not careful. And that's where we come back to our principles of justice, beneficence, autonomy, and non-maleficence, and also the principles that I cannot do evil for a good end, and that I can never use a person as a means to an end. So if we use those principles and try to really keep them at the forefront of any decisions that we make, it does help. We still have to be really careful.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your question.
And then you had touched about the 5 physical senses, but Mary Rose had asked about what about the fact that we have internal senses as well?
Okay, I love that question. So Mary Rose, can you give an example of an internal sense?
Like the sense of time. You can close your eyes and you can estimate how much time it is. There's like a lot of examples. I just don't have them.
Yeah, I think was one of them also a sense of place, like you kind of know where you are in a
Yeah.
room, for example. Yeah. So I do believe that those are scientific senses. I think they are physical senses. They're based on, for example, like I'm not sure if you would include sense of balance as one of the senses, but I know that that's based on like the inner ear. But if the senses are based on our physical body, then they are senses that can be studied by science. If we talk about like a religious sense, which is really nothing to do with the physical body, then that would be in the realm of theology. Is that your question, Mary Rose? Like whether the inner senses are in the realm of science or not?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, yeah. I guess I'd have to think of each one separately and see, but as long as it's something that we can weigh and measure, it's in the realm of science. But great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And if we don't have Abby, did you see any more questions in the chat?
Let me see. I think that was the last one. If anyone has though any questions for Mary Jo, please feel free to type them in the chat. We have about 3 minutes left, so I do want to be cognizant of time, but if you have any questions and we don't get to them, or you think of any later, of course, please feel free to reach out to either Sabina and I, and we will make sure Mary Jo gets a chance to answer them.
That'd be great.
I know that this is a topic that maybe you'll continue to ruminate and think on for maybe the next couple of days, as I will, and you'll come up with lots of interesting thoughts and points and questions about theories of existence, etc.
Yeah.
I think also proves the point that really philosophy and understanding is the basis of everything that human has gone on to do. And so it's so important to continue to think and understand and experience these questions. Mary Jo, I think we had, let me pop over to my AT guy. Go ahead, Sabina.
We have one more question for you.
Oh, go ahead.
So with the words of advice, because that's how we always end our event, what would what advice would you give to all the kids / adults on this call, because we're all interested in bioethics now, to follow your footsteps or to learn more about bioethics in general? And you did note that free class with the University of Helsinki, but what else can we do?
I think that it's such a wide field. It's hard to know really where to start. Some of the books that I read are I have a book called Personalist Bioethics, but it requires a lot of previous philosophy to really understand it. But I think just just asking the questions and keep the dignity of the human person at the forefront. One thing I would like to say is that if we have a true respect for persons, we really know what a person is. A person, I believe, calls for a response of love. And I don't mean love as a feeling, I mean love as willing the good for a person and also having the components of compassion and caring and sort of a warmth and tenderness. And if I could just end with a really quick little story. We had a pediatrician when my oldest kids were very little, and this pediatrician was sort of socially awkward, honestly. And but we all loved him. My kids loved him. I loved him. And the reason why was because we knew that he really cared about my kids. He was a great doctor and he cared about them, and they didn't, they overlooked all his sort of awkwardness. And I think that if we have love as a proper response, we won't make some of these really bad mistakes. I think that if it were our husband or father or brother in those Tuskegee experiments, we would never have not given them the medicine that was available. We'd say, we have something to help you. We have something to cure you. Of course, we're going to give it to you. And if we look at that sort of respect for the human person, the person calls for a response of love, I think we will avoid a lot of the more major errors that we can commit.
I think so too. And again, I think love is the way to, shift the narrative and dialogue. So thank you, Mary Jo. And so with that, again, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to Abby or myself. And if Mary Jo wants to, she can share her email with you all as well.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So I'll include that in the email. And for next month, we have another amazing Ask the Experts. Again, thank you so much, Mary Jo, for giving us such amazing insight into bioethics. I learned a lot. I know our kids learned a lot, and the adults on as well. And so next month is with Dr. Harvey Castro, and he is actually an AI expert in healthcare, as Mary Jo was talking about that a lot. So he's going to be talking about that. And then we also have a 5K run this Thursday, October 24th. Abby and I and the entire iCAN team is traveling to North Carolina for it. And so if you want to participate virtually, you're more than welcome to participate. We would love to see you take pictures of yourself doing a 5K. We would really love that. Our fundraiser is called Impactful. And then we also have a silent auction fundraiser with some amazing things to bid on. And that's from October 24th to 31st. So we're looking forward to that. But until next time, thank you so much. We are very excited to see you all on November 16th. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.